session of our 2021 Women in Municipal Government Salon Series. So as those of you that have participated in Salon Series in the past, things look a little bit different this year as we are all virtual. Those of you that are joining us for the first time, we promise to keep the intimate setting of our Salon Series that we've always had here in this virtual format. To help us do that, I ask that if you are able to join with your video, highly encourage you to do that so that we can really feel like we are in conference with each other tonight. I would appreciate that, but I do understand if you're not able to do that, no worries. So the Salon Series this year, as I just said, is Women in Municipal Government. The goal of this Salon Series is to provide our members with an opportunity to learn more about how to be involved in government and how it can allow the achievement of a greater impact in our communities where we work and live and serve in the Junior League. So I couldn't be more excited to welcome tonight Kate Lipper-Garabedian. She has very willingly come tonight to talk about her story. She is a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. She represents the 36th district. She has dedicated her professional career to public service. Her first job was a 7th grade public school teacher in an economically disadvantaged neighborhood of Atlanta. After graduating from Harvard Law School, she worked as a judicial clerk in the federal courts and as a consultant for states, school districts, colleges, universities, and nonprofits on efforts to improve outcomes for children and students, something I know we all care deeply about. Before joining the General Court, Kate served as the Chief Legal Counsel at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Education and was a city councilor at large in Melrose. Kate lives with her husband, Mark, sons Harrison and Oscar, and family dog Baron. So we're so excited. I'm going to pass over to Kate. She's going to give us a little overview of how she got to where she is today, what inspired her to do that. And then everybody just get your questions ready. This is a conversation. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your questions. I think just to make things easier, if everybody can use the raised hand feature, if anyone doesn't know how to use that, just pop it in the chat so we can talk you through it. And if you aren't able to speak, to unmute yourself tonight, just feel free to put your questions directly in the chat and either Shannon or I will voice those for you. Great, so I'll pass it over to you, Kate. Thank you again for joining the Junior League of Boston tonight.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. And it's nice to see everybody. I hope you are well. These are remarkable times we're living in, but as we were saying at the beginning, before we got really started, there are some advantages to the technology that we have. So it's nice that we figured out ways to utilize that to make space like these for us to have a chance to build community and learn from each other and learn about each other. So I don't have a whole lot prepared. I'm really interested in letting you all drive the conversation and focusing on the issues or topics or questions you have. But I'm happy to provide just a sort of brief overview of who I am and what I do. So as Caitlin said, I am a state representative here in Massachusetts. We have 160 state representatives. It's a full-time job in our state. I grew up in Virginia, where the legislature only meets a couple months out of the year typically. Here we are always in session for 2-year sessions. We have a state senate as well, and there are 40 senators. So I've only been a state rep actually for less than a year. So maybe backing all the way up, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I went to the public school system there in the city. I was from a white middle-class family, and for the first 9 years of my public school, I was a racial minority. I don't think that's very typical these days in the United States, and I think it sort of well, I know it influenced a little bit of how I think about my professional career and how our country is organized and the ways in which democratically elected government can really make a real difference, a positive difference for individuals and their families, but that we also have, historically not always passed the best policies, the most equitable, the most thoughtful, and driving towards justice for all. So went to public school, and for my high school, I also stayed in public school, but went to a magnet program that drew from a variety of districts around the city of Richmond, and immediately saw the differences in terms of resources that were allocated, the type of professional development my teachers could access, the sort of ability to access rigorous coursework. And there was a real stark difference there. And it wasn't entirely surprising to me because I grew up in a household with two journalists for my parents. My mother covered state politics and national politics, first as a political reporter and then as an editorial writer for the Norfolk paper. My father was also a reporter. He was a sports columnist. So in addition to having a passion for public policy, I really liked sports as well. And for those of you who are Patriots fans and managed to still root for Tom Brady, my husband is a Patriots fan, couldn't bring himself to root for Tom Brady. I am not a Patriots fan, but ended up rooting for the old guy. I hope you enjoyed that if that's your thing. So in any event, my mother covered politics, and I remember going with her sometimes to some political events. When Doug Wilder ran for governor of Virginia and became the first elected Black governor in the country, I had gone to some of his rallies and debates. When welfare reform was passed in the 1990s, my mother did a series of articles over the course of a year following families in Richmond and seeing how those new requirements impacted them. And I remember going with her occasionally to meet with the families at their homes, and once going back, and the family had moved and none of the neighbors knew where they were. And it was like they had just been erased. And it sort of stuck with me that maybe there was no real causal impact there, but perhaps there was. So again, the things that we do in government at any level can have immediate real life impact for families in both good and bad ways. So after college, I taught, as Caitlin mentioned, for a couple years in Atlanta. That was the most challenging job I've ever had and also the most rewarding. I actually just got a Facebook message from one of my students who's applying to law school right now. I'm going to be reviewing her essays. I've got other students who have become teachers themselves in the Atlanta public school system. So it's pretty amazing. They're way older than I was when I taught them at this point. So it's nuts. But I did that for a couple of years, and that reinforced for me the interest in thinking about our systemic problems at a more macro level. So teaching was incredibly rewarding, but I also watched my kids go on to a new classroom where they might still be facing some of the challenges that they faced in my room. And I thought, well, maybe there are ways that we can pull some levers on an educational structural basis that would really make a difference for them and the students who come after. So I headed to law school. And then focused on education law and policy where I could. I cross-registered in classes at the Graduate School of Education or at the business school. And then after 1 year of clerking for a judge, I have spent the rest of my legal career until this past year exclusively focused on education issues. So working with early education all the way through higher ed and just thinking about ways we can structure our state programs, our college admissions policies, our early education governance structures, and ways that create more opportunities for the students who need it most. And that included for 5 years working at our Executive Office of Education here in Massachusetts. So just like at the presidential level, the governor here in Massachusetts has a cabinet of secretaries who oversee executive offices. And one of the secretaries is our Secretary of Education. And so he or she is the governor's advisor on education matters. And I supported that secretary as his chief legal counsel. And we were more of a think tank because we're transient in nature. As soon as there's a new governor, then there'll be a new secretary, almost certainly, and a new staff for that. But we do have in Massachusetts 3 departments of education, one that works with early education and care, so the birth to 5 age group. One that works with our K-12, that's the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. They're based in Malden. They're called DESE. And if you're a parent, which you all may not be yet, but as soon as you are, DESE starts coming up a lot in your conversations. And especially this year with COVID, obviously, every district has had to really turn on a dime and try to look to the state for supports and think about how we're going to reach kids when many are learning remotely or in a hybrid setting. And then there's a Department of Higher Education, which coordinates with our community colleges and our state universities and UMass which also has its own board. So my boss, the secretary, sat on the boards of each of those departments in UMass, and we worked as an office to support all of those departments and think about ways to coordinate and build collaboration, because we all know that, you know, when a kid goes from 4 to 5, they're still the same kid, even if they're sort of entering a new structure. And so thinking about ways to ensure that their through lines for that student is really important. And then when we moved to Melrose, and this was shortly before I started at the executive office, we'd had our first son, and Harrison turned 1 here in Melrose. And so something about, you know, it's silly, but it is sort of like when you put down roots, you start to kind of become more local and focused on, so what's happening right here and how can I be involved where I've made a real investment. This is the first home I've ever owned. So it was sort of taking a stock of like, how is our, you know, as somebody who thinks that, you know, I'm a smart and informed consumer of information and what have you, I didn't even really look into how are our localities structured. So I ended up in a city. I just picked it because it was close to Boston and on the Orange Line, and we could afford a decent sized house compared to some of the other places we were looking. And the place that we bought, well, it is the first place I've ever lived with a driveway. I can still walk to the gym and to, you know, I'm used to living in more of a city. So that's why we picked it. But it turns out we're a city government. So we have a mayor, we have a city council. Like every city in town, we have a school committee. And then, of course, we have many different boards and commissions that are often, in our case, appointed by the mayor. But in some places, like in towns like Wakefield, which is just to my north, and I represent part of Wakefield now, people run for some of the boards and commissions that here the mayor appoints. So it gave me an opportunity to sort of take a look at where maybe I could be involved, since I knew we'd be here for a long time. And I started out on an advisory committee to the mayor about birth to 5. So focusing on the new, you know, families with younger children and how to sort of integrate into the community and provide supports for new parents. That was especially important to me as a new parent, and also somebody who had very severe postpartum depression for the first few months with my first. And just knowing how isolating that time can be, and thinking about ways that birth to 5 could connect new parents together was very gratifying for me. So I did that. And then there was an advisory group that the superintendent put together about competency-based education, and maybe thinking about new ways to structure learning where it's not just about your age and what grade you're supposed to be in, but rather let's let students sort of be more personalized their trajectories. And if someone needs more time in something, that's fine. And if someone is really ready to advance to the next level, let's encourage that. So I worked on that with the superintendent, and then sort of thought, well, what's next? And realized that maybe the city council would be an interesting place to work. Obviously, just as an addition to the full-time job that I was doing. So I ran for city council in 2017. And if anyone wants to talk about campaigns, we can definitely do that. That's a whole conversation. But for me, it was mostly just sitting around a table with my husband and our close friends and all volunteers and figuring it out. And then doing a lot of door knocking to learn the city better, and getting elected and sworn in while I was pregnant with our second son in beginning of 2018. And so I did that for 2 years, and then ran for re-election, was re-elected. And at the same time, the representative for Melrose and the district, which is also part of Wakefield, just to our north, and a little sliver of Malden to our south, became elected our mayor of Melrose. So he left the state rep position, became mayor. And so I had been doing the education, executive office of education full time. I'd been going full steam in the city council. And I thought, this is a lot. I have 2 young kids. Maybe I can combine what I like about both of these positions, because I loved the constituent service side of city council. I really liked being able to help people navigate an issue that they had and try to demonstrate that government can be really responsive and help them solve a problem. Or they might bring in an idea and a solution to me, and then I would learn from them and be able to suggest something that could be brought citywide or integrated into the way we were doing things, but just improve it. So it was very much a synergistic relationship. And it enabled me to sort of reinforce for people that government is there to support them and to improve their lives. So I loved that part of city council. And I like thinking about sort of the local laws and ordinances. But I also really loved EOE because we were thinking about things at a statewide level and big policy and things that could move the lever for kids all over. And so state rep was appealing because I realized I could do some of what I liked about both. So I ran in a special election over the winter of 2020, or I guess 2019 into 2020. And there was a primary in February of last year, just a year ago, and then the general in March, and I was elected. And then the whole world fell apart. So, when I was door knocking, the number one things people talked about were the MBTA, which is still a huge issue. They talked a lot about the climate crisis and just affordability generally. Education would have been a huge issue, and it still always will be, except that the state had just passed a major education funding reform law that I'd helped work on in my previous role. So the legislature had just passed that. The governor had signed it. It was going to invest billions more dollars in the way that we fund our schools. So that had sort of let people at that time feel a little bit more confident about, okay, schools are in a good place, but the T, not so much, the climate, not so much, but no one was talking about a public health pandemic. So I got elected, and then within a week, we had a state of emergency. No one was going into the office. In fact, all my things are still at EOE, like my pictures, my blanket when it got cold, everything's in my old office. And so I didn't even know when I would get sworn in, but if you go back in my text chain, it's sort of like, maybe next week, we're not sure. And then finally I did. It was March 25th of last year. So rather than be in the chamber with the House of Representatives and the governor signing me in there, swearing me in there, excuse me, it was in an open staircase, airy room, and we're sort of spread out, but no one's wearing masks yet because we didn't know masks were important. So it's sort of like a capture in time of like an artifact of where we were at that moment. I couldn't bring any of my family. So did that, and then have been serving the district ever since. And so as you all probably can imagine, the number one challenge that everyone's facing is just dealing with a public health crisis and the economic fallout from that. So along with all my other colleagues, we're supporting like an astronomically larger number of people who are on unemployment and applying for benefits, or people who are needing to figure out ways to get food on their table. Housing insecurity is a big issue for people, being able to pay rent or continue to pay their mortgage. Small landlords whose tenants aren't able to pay rent, and what do they do? So my district is, I would say, I can't say for certain. My sense is we're fairly stable and better off than the gateway city. So like Malden, which is a slice of my district, that has different challenges compared to Melrose and Wakefield. So there is that, but no district has been untouched by this. So there's been a lot of focus on just making sure to connect constituents with the resources and programs that are available, to make sure we're investing in those services through our budgeting processes, both by allocating all the federal stimulus dollars that we've gotten so far, by drawing down our rainy day fund that the state had built up over the last decade pretty significantly, so that we've been able to deploy those dollars to things like historic investments in our rental assistance program, just by way of one example. So there was that, and then despite all of that, we also managed last year to pass a lot of pretty big bills. So we did a law enforcement reform bill that the governor signed toward the end of last year. We passed an economic development bill that was addressing a lot of the issues with COVID, but also more longstanding, like our housing stock and how unaffordable housing has become in Boston. That's a pre-COVID condition. So there's some flexibility and new zoning things that we put in place through the bill that the governor just did a ceremony today to sign. We updated our reproductive healthcare access laws here in the state at the end of last session and overrode a veto by the governor to do that. We passed a climate bill that he did veto, but that's a little bit on our state legislature for doing it at the very last minute and not giving the governor enough time to provide his own comments and feedback. So we just refiled it and just passed it, and he just returned it to us last week with amendments. So I'm going through those amendments with colleagues, and we're thinking about how we'll handle those, and if we'll make modifications in the bill, or if we return it to him, rejecting those amendments, at which case he could veto, and then we'd have to override the veto. So as a freshman rep, essentially, I'm going to let my more seasoned colleagues read the tea leaves on how to exactly navigate that. But as I mentioned at the outset, climate is a huge issue personally for me, and then also for the district that I represent. And it's an existential crisis. And so I'm certain that we're going to get something pretty bolds done, and hopefully in short order, so we can continue to work on that. And then that's sort of unusual that the legislature would have already taken back up a bill and filed it again and taken it to the House and the Senate floor and voted it and sent it to the governor. Typically what happens and what's going on right now is every office scrambles to file the bills that we want to focus on this session. So I'm doing that right now. And I'll probably file between like 15 and 20 bills maybe. And some of them are things that Paul Broder, my predecessor, filed that didn't get over the finish line, that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, that had good partners working on it. So I'm refiling those maybe with some adjustments. Some are bills that other folks have led on in the past, but they've brought me on to support them because of my content background. So one example would be a student data privacy piece. So that's something I worked on a lot, both at EOE, but also in the job where I was the consultant. I worked a lot on making sure that particularly school districts, but also higher ed, but particularly school districts were figuring out ways to collect data about their students so that they could tailor instruction. Like when I was a teacher, we didn't have a lot of resources because I mean, I'm not that old, but I guess I'm old enough that we didn't have a lot of these software programs that my son Harrison has now that are able to give teachers diagnostic and formative information over the course of the year. Like he just took one today and he came in to tell me, I took another iReady. Can you find out how I scored? I want to know. And so we can find that out quickly. When I was teaching, I saw what the students did on the state test the year before. I did sort of a fluency reading test with them at the beginning of the year that I just did personally, not by the system, and then would try my best to track it over time. But data can have such power for teachers to be able to see, like, where is Harrison struggling with reading comprehension or whatever it might be, and then be able to really help make up that deficit. So I want districts to be able to use that data and to find software to use. At the same time, I'm worried about the fact that I don't think Melrose has a lot of capacity to make sure that Harrison's data is actually being used strictly for K-12 purposes and not creating a massive data footprint so that will follow him wherever he goes, into college, if he wants to go in that route, or to a job, or wherever. So our state laws have not been updated on student data privacy in decades, nor has the federal government, nor has Congress updated FERPA. So I've been working really strongly on that with some district leaders, some privacy folks. DESE is at the table, and we're going to refile that next week. So that's something that I'm really hoping in a COVID world, especially, people will see, yeah, this is important for us to make sure that student data is protected and used appropriately. So anyway, we're doing all of that. I'll get assigned to committees at some point. I'm hoping I might be on the education committee. I requested the energy committee because that's where a lot of the climate bills end up being assigned. And then I also suggested judiciary because there's been some, as trained as an attorney, I think that I could be useful there. But my sense is the speaker will put me wherever, as he should. He has 159 other people telling him where they want to go. So maybe I'll get one of those choices. We'll see. But I'm just excited to get to work on some higher level policy and then just continue to support the district as best I can. I guess the last thing I'll say, and then would love to hear from you all about your interest in government or elected office, is that I've been really proud of the degree to which I've continued to build my relationship with the community writ large. And major way that I do that, maybe not surprisingly, as the daughter of journalists, is through communication. So I maintain a very active social media presence on I guess 3 platforms. And then I also do a comprehensive newsletter every week. And so the one last week, for example, was all about vaccinations and the rollout there and what's going on and how anyone who's 75 and up can apply, and was actually able to help maybe about a dozen constituents last week schedule appointments because they were struggling with the online system, understandably. And that might have been the most gratifying thing I've worked on as a state rep. So, I'd love to hear from you all too about ways in which you find that, you think communication, where you've seen communication be really strong, what are strategies for that, platforms. Obviously, I also use the local newspapers because my parents would be disappointed if I didn't. So, and including to reach people who aren't necessarily online, but always looking for good ideas. And I think that is cross sector. So happy to get suggestions from you all as well. So I'll stop there and just be glad to be in conversation with you. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. Yes, so if people just want to jump in with questions, feel free to raise your hand so we can kind of navigate through.
And if you want to put in like the chat where you live, I'd be interested just to know who's represented today and or what kind of work you're doing. But yeah, happy to talk about government, politics, campaigns, you name it. And I think Kate is
Hi.
Hi.
I actually live in Melrose.
Oh, wonderful.
So I was very excited when I saw your name on the list of Salon series participants. So I immediately wanted to attend yours because I had recognized your name from campaigns and around town. So I just wanted to say hi and from Melrose.
Thank you.
What ways would I be able to volunteer to get involved in the city?
So to get involved in the city, well, one thing that's great is that the Mayor Broder has made, I think, and this was something I mentioned in my re-election campaign, was let's make it easier for people to know about what boards and commissions actually exist, how long, an appointment might last, or if it's sort of just on a volunteer basis, anyone can show up and get started. Because what I worried about was that people were sort of handpicked based on just who knows who. And that's not always a bad thing, but it does suggest that we're maybe missing out on candidates who are diverse in various ways because they're just not as integrated into the system yet for whatever reasons, including they might be new to the city. So I know that City Hall does maintain now a web page that lists out all of the different mayor boards and commissions where the mayor would appoint them. And then there are a good number that are, I think just if you show up, you can be involved. So if there's something you're passionate about, by way of one example, we have a really active pedestrian and bicycle committee that is frequently looking for ways to make streets safer and more accessible for different modalities. And because we're living in COVID, everybody's meeting remotely. So in some ways, there's less of a hurdle to getting to the meeting because you can just do it from where you're sitting right now. So that's one example. But if there, if obviously you're welcome to follow up with me offline as well, if there's something you're passionate about, and then we can see what exists.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's great to be in touch with you.
Yes, you too.
I think I saw Lynn has her hand raised.
I do. Just a quick note on the previous question. One of the areas of diversity that boards, like local boards, actually do care about is age. It's just generally very typical that people who are like older and more established want to sort of participate in government. So the fact that if you are younger, if you are not necessarily kind of entrenched, like that's actually an area of diversity that's really interesting to boards. So just a note. But so Kate, other Kate, I work for the Department of Energy Resources, and something that we are actually dealing with right now that is being kind of, that our expertise is kind of technical and kind of concrete and not necessarily, we don't see ourselves necessarily as human services people, although we kind of are. The challenge that we're having right now is actually communicating, particularly in the context of the settlement about the explosions in Merrimack Valley,
Right.
Communicating in different languages and trying to make sure that we're getting feedback from people who don't necessarily speak English as a first language. And I was wondering, I'm assuming that in education and in Melrose that there would be a little bit more experience with that. So how do you kind of get that exposure in different languages?
That's a great question. So I only speak English. When I studied abroad, I went to South Africa where they have 11 national languages. So everyone looked at me like I was crazy when I said I only spoke English. And I think Malden does have more of a diverse language base than Melrose and Wakefield, certainly, although of course other languages are represented here. One thing that I've found with respect to communication is that whether certain departments like Department of Public Health is putting out a lot of the communication right now around COVID, for example. And we've pressed them at the legislature, and they've been very much focused on this too, about ensuring that all of the digital media is available in multiple languages, that the call centers can handle that. So the COVID-19 vaccination hotline that was just stood up on Friday for those 75 and older is available in English and Spanish, but then there are translators available in up to 100 languages. My expectation is you call and then they have someone call back in that language, because I don't think they have everybody available. So there's that. One thing I think as well is just partnering with organizations in the subject matters that matter to you. So, on food security issues, there are some tremendous nonprofit organizations that are leading the call on, expanding benefits during this time, ensuring that EBT cards can be used in various locations. So Bread of Life is a big organizing nonprofit in that way, and they take the time to put together the communications package that we can then use on our media. I'm thinking another example would be the Health Connector. So assisting people with getting, on mass health or on another affordable healthcare plan. They often will reach out to state legislators and say, we've got a deadline coming up, here's some media that we can use. And then we're able to I can put it up in different languages. But if you have other ideas in terms of, things that you've seen at your agency or with your own state legislators, that's definitely an area that I can improve in.
Yeah, no, it's really hard. and something that we've actually found right now is that we have a survey in English and Spanish for Lawrence Andover, North Andover, but obviously we care about getting feedback in Lawrence because it's easy to get feedback in English when you are sort of natively communicating in English. But we're noticing that the only responses that we're getting are in English so far. Mm-hmm. So I would really love
it's not entirely representative, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So just, if you
it's not just similar. I mean, it reminds me also of just the campaigning where when you try to go door to door, you cannot get into certain buildings, right? For rentals, particularly. And that's an entire population that really is important to understand what their needs are in a city like mine. And it's harder to reach folks because you aren't able to go right up to the door and do a leave behind if they're not home. And I remember being asked that at one of the forums that we had, I think maybe it was the Democratic City Committee, about how do you reach folks? And I think even the, people who are more seasoned than me find it to be a challenge. So hopefully we'll come up with solutions over time to this, but I guess it's good at least to keep a spotlight on it as well. So thanks for the work you're doing there too. I know that, that issue, I believe there are sections of the climate bill that are related to that as well. I'm just seeing where everybody lived. I lived briefly in the South Boston, Kathy. Before, like right after I got married, and before we moved to DC after about a year in South Boston. We were there for like 3 years or so.
At this point, I'm the picture that came with the frame. My family's been here for generations.
Oh, how nice.
On the same block.
Oh, really? Amazing.
And I worked the elections for Boston, and thank God it's like a block from home, because I would not still be doing it, because you have to be there like 6 a.m. and it's a very long day. So and actually Congressman Lynch votes in my the polling location I work in.
How neat.
And I love seeing it's like I love like the voting process, like just kind of like making sure everybody has like the access and getting everybody, like keeping everything flowing. And I say we have our regulars.
Yes.
If there's one city council race, they're there, hand them a ballot, they're good to go. Happy clams. And then the people are like, oh, I didn't realize it was an election today. I'm like, really? There's signs like everywhere. But and I've literally gone from watching like his daughter, like his whole family, like in the area there. His sister Jill's like, oh, hi, honey. I'll give you a big hug. When we could do that.
Right.
And I've watched like his daughter be like coming along to be with them to vote, and then be like helping her, like when she was there voting the first time. It was like, oh, it's like she's so it's like so
That's really great.
but yeah, we've been
I noticed when I was holding signs in, even though I ran unopposed this in the fall, I think would have been a little challenging for someone to run against me since I had just been elected in March after a competitive race, and because COVID hit. So it was sort of like, how would you even do that? But nonetheless, I wanted to be at the polls just to say hi to people. So we were, holding signs and distanced and whatever. But I feel like this year more than ever, people really just felt such pride in being able to do it. And it was a moment where you could sort of reassert that you were part of a community and something bigger when we've all been stuck inside and really isolated from each other. So it was really touching to just be able to see so many people. And I'm sure for you, Kathy, it was really nice too, even if you couldn't hug.
Yeah, I actually did, due to like some family like health concerns.
Oh, sure.
It's in an elderly and disabled housing building.
Got it.
I was like, just thought, and it was like things were still real.
Yeah.
Not that they're awesome now, but they were like really like.
Yes.
And I was like, I just don't feel comfortable. And they were like, that's fine, no worries.
Good.
And it was like, and then I was like, oh sure, now everybody thanks us.
No, that's fair. Well, maybe from now on we'll remember how much goes into it. And you may have seen, there are people who are filing bills right now related to how we're going to do elections moving forward. I mean, one example where COVID has taught us some things, there are some that come to mind is like, this will really make a difference and improve things moving forward. So telehealth is a great example. We passed a healthcare bill last year, and we've seen that for many physical or mental health concerns, meeting with somebody like we're meeting right now can actually work really effectively. And so the bill that we passed and that the governor signed creates more equity in terms of payments for that. So that's great. Another one was our elections reforms that were limited in time to last year because they were driven by concerns about public health, but we expanded the ability for anybody to vote by mail. And I did that where I dropped it off at, I actually walked it over and dropped it into one of the mail boxes that were set up, secured for just that purpose, but you could have mailed it. And then we expanded our early in-person voting window. So people had at least one full weekend for the primary voting and 2 for the general election. And we just saw record turnout, although there's still some level of unevenness in that. So we need to explore that in terms of making sure people really do have equal access. But I think, my colleagues saw enough to suggest that some of these things we should consider doing moving forward. So there may be plenty more opportunities, Kathy, for you to be at the polls and maybe for more days than in the past.
Yeah, and I also have family and family friends in Melrose.
Oh, great.
So I was like,
very nice.
I remember the family friends first, but the family, my cousin and his wife live there, and his wife is somewhat politically active, so you may have come across her.
Great. Well, maybe I will. Feel free to make an introduction later if you'd like.
If you've run into anyone who's really opinionated with really red hair.
Okay. Great. I see maybe Pinderty.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Hendry. I actually live in Cambridge, where it's incredibly difficult, I found, to serve on any boards or volunteers because there's just so many people who are interested in that kind of thing in this part of the city. But you mentioned your constituent services and other people who have reached out to you with ideas and thoughts. As the League is working on expanding our advocacy efforts, and one of our community partners is looking to do the same, what have you found are ways that have been helpful when your constituents approach you or come to you with ideas? What's a good way to get our point across there?
Well, that's a good question. I think it helps when somebody can speak to an issue because of a personal or lived experience, so that they can actually discuss firsthand why the issue matters. Now, of course, issues matter to people all the time that are really important, even if they're not necessarily firsthand impacted by it. So that's not to suggest otherwise, but I'm just thinking by way of example of a doctor in town who reached out to me because he wanted us to consider changing how glaucoma is able to be treated and who can prescribe what. I mean, you've heard my background. None of this was like gibberish to me, but he could describe like how this was difficult for him, particularly with COVID, where he had somebody because of how he's licensed, whether or not he could prescribe topical medication or if they actually had to go somewhere else to receive. In any event, he was able to sort of walk me through it. And I was then able to reach out to now Speaker Mariano, who was incredibly receptive to talk to me one-on-one. And I could share, like, I have this constituent and here's what he's describing. And of course, the speaker already knew all about this because he has a healthcare background and he could sort of explain, we're getting an echo, but he could explain, how this, policy was navigating its way through the State House. Eventually it got passed, right? And so I was planning to file the bill again this January, but in the healthcare bill that we passed, it was included, which was fantastic. But because he, again, could describe specific anecdotal examples to sort of ground me in the policy writ large, I found that to be really effective. And obviously that can be done as well by bringing in other people, even if you're not the person who is dealing with the challenge. When you bring, when it's your constituents and some of the advocates or friends or family or whoever who've experienced that challenge or that issue, that can be really effective, I think. I think it also helps the relationship between elected official and advocate is really important. Advocates are all about pushing, right? Moving towards something new. And also can be appropriately so somewhat focused and myopic and not in a pejorative sense on that one issue. And I am responsible for not only representing the folks who care about it in this way, but all, the full community on that issue, plus all the other issues that matter, and thinking about how we are going to, I guess, maybe it's sort of that philosophical, like utility, like moving as much progress forward as we can while bringing as many people along, knowing that there is only so much bandwidth and capacity in any one session to process all the bills. And so recognizing there has to be prioritization, and that there's this dynamic of, not everyone even agrees on any particular issue. Will we have the votes necessary to override a veto if we wanted to, that sort of thing. So I'm responsible for sort of holding all of that together and also feeling a level of responsibility to make sure I'm able to articulate why I take a position when I do, to people who will fundamentally disagree with that, even though I'm supposed to be representing them as well, even though I am representing them as well. And of course, can't make everyone happy, but it's important for me to try to ensure that people don't become disillusioned with the system, because we've seen that happen. And we've seen how that can be perverted into terrible things like an insurrection in DC just this year. So being able to be mindful of that has been important. And at times, even people with whom I philosophically agree, I worry about the way in which they're advocating for someone, for that issue, and how it can make me less effective if they're unwilling to sort of recognize the importance of occasional moderation, even if that's sort of the antithesis of what an advocate is supposed to be leading on. But I've definitely seen advocacy organizations recognize that dynamic and move through it successfully.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Sure.
Are there particular issues that you care a lot about or that you would be interested in focusing on at the local level?
So far this year, I think the League is working on the Crown Act and natural hair discrimination. We've started to get involved in that. One of our community partners is called the Jeremiah Program, and they support women looking to attain their college degree, single parents looking to attain their college degrees, and they're just starting some advocacy and policy work. So we are at the beginning of this road and trying to learn all we can to be successful.
Great. Well, happy to stay in touch. And of course, I'm sure your representative and legislator would also love to hear from you. So. Kathleen, I see a hand raised, and I'm sorry if I'm missing people or calling people out of order.
I think that the function has, when the hand raises, it pushes you up
Oh, nice.
on the chat so that you'll get to see something.
My
But
7-year-old would have been able to tell me that if he's been here. Fixes all my problems for me on Zoom.
Actually what you were just kind of talking with Pendry with was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. So you'd said that you maintain a social media profile on multiple platforms. And so while our individual league, the Junior League of Boston, has had really great conversations about, people agree or disagree on something. We're part of an association that's an international association, and sometimes the conversations get a little dicey and sometimes disrespectful. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips for people who are talking about things that are, like, again, we do some advocacy work. So there are things that we're kind of like, we really believe that this is the thing, and how you are able to mitigate different points of view and, kind of make your opinion be known without being disrespectful. And when you do come up against people who are kind of trollish,
Yeah.
what some of your more effective ways are of kind of like quieting the conversation and bringing it back onto point.
So I would start by saying, your question seems to be both about social. You mentioned social media. So is that sort of the form in which you're talking, or is it both social media and then also like a conversation like this?
Yeah, kind of both. So,
Okay.
so in social media, and then also as we're working, so our advocacy works on a number of different organizations like the Boston Food Access Council. We're working with the Crown Act. We're working on gender parity on public boards. We do advocacy work for women who've been sexually abused or domestic violence. So sometimes there's, emotions can run high on that, and how, so in social media, sort of specifically dealing with trolls. And then also as we are bringing our message forward, how we take our passion and compassion, but make that message, some of what you were saying before is kind of like taking that personal approach. This is important for me because of A, B, and C.
Right.
And how we kind of come out without being like, this is so important. We want to be able to be emphatic without being myopic.
Got it. So I don't know if I'll be able to completely answer the question, in part because my position is different from yours. Insofar as, you are taking a position on a particular issue. And I guess what I'm doing is I'm letting people know where my position is, but also reflecting on the fact that I represent them and they may disagree. I'll start out by saying for social media, I don't engage much at all. I use it to put out information, including for people to hold me accountable on the positions that I take, but I'm very unlikely to respond to a tweet or to respond to a Facebook message that is inflammatory or sort of probing or seeking to get a reaction, because I just haven't ever seen that become an effective method in which to respectfully engage with someone. There's a very senior woman in the House who's risen in leadership who I love, and I'd shown her this terrible meme that someone had made of my face with cash behind me about a vote that I had taken on an amendment to the law enforcement bill where they felt like I hadn't gone far enough. And it was really awful. And I sort of said, do I need to say what, I've never seen something like this. And she said, you don't need pen pals on Facebook. And it's really true. So I just let it go. And if people tweet at me, I very rarely respond, because if they are asking for legitimate information, if they need an answer to a question, absolutely. But if they're trying to get me if they're calling me out for a vote, they know how to find me so that we can have a really substantive conversation. And it doesn't need to be on a social media platform. If you've seen Social Dilemma on Netflix, which was sort of all the rage last year, and if you haven't, it's very good and sort of forecasts a little bit of what happened at the turn of this calendar year. It sort of reinforces that social media has really taken on a life of its own and is just not a place where you go to convince anybody or inform anybody really on a position. So I just don't. When it comes to people reaching out to me because they're disappointed, because they want me to vote in a certain way, and I'm not going to vote in that way, or because I've already voted and they're really disgusted. Like almost always I respond. In fact, always. There's not a single constituent who's reached out that I haven't acknowledged that I've heard from them, and then I sort of say something like, I know that this is a divisive issue, but I've always felt this way for the reproductive health care access bill is one that comes to mind. I've just always felt this way. And I've been very upfront about that in my campaigns and in all of my communication. This is just important to me. And I know that we're just going to disagree on this. And that there's a constituent in town who has been with me from the very beginning when I ran, who just was so taken by me when we first met. And he reached out and said, I'm just really struggling with this. And I wrote him back, and he still says hi to me, and he sent me a small donation at the end of this year. So for me, it's a little different, perhaps in the dynamic of so far as a representative, the mayor has said no one vote is necessarily going to change anyone's mind about you. So you can kind of see a holistic picture of who Kate is and how she approaches the issues. I would hope no one would ever say I'm thoughtless in the decisions that I make and the votes that I take, but that they recognize I do my homework and I try my best to sort of reflect where the district might be, but that on certain things, it's just there. It's a non-negotiable for me. And reproductive health care access is one of the few that I could say that about. But I don't know if that helps some. I have been in one meeting so far in my short time where there was one constituent who got incredibly toxic and threatening, and there other people were sort of watching, and the people who had organized it later apologized, and a couple of the other constituents reached out and apologized, and he was just really unhinged. And I don't know if that's the kind of thing you've ever dealt with. It really took me back. I briefly sort of choked up because I couldn't believe how toxic it was. But it was nice that other people were able to sort of acknowledge that. And so to the degree that anybody on your side of the argument sort of takes on that unprofessional tone, I think it lends off a level of credibility to be compassionate to the other group and sort of model the way that you would hope they would approach a disagreement or divisive issue as well.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
No, well, good.
Just to give us a little time check here, we only have 4 more minutes. So if you have any burning questions, now's the time.
I'll put my email in the chat, so people are welcome to check in that way as well. And if you wanted to just take a look at some of the newsletters that I send out every week, the one from February 2nd, I would say if you have people you care about, I haven't seen everybody on here tonight, but I'm not sure. The people who I have seen, I think I can safely say you're not 75 or older. But if you have loved ones who are, or if you may be someone who has 2 comorbidities and will be in the next group that will be able to be eligible for vaccinations. The newsletter that I put together on February 2nd is pretty comprehensive in terms of some of the resources and information about the vaccination program right now. So that might be one to consult or to share because it works broadly for anybody in the state. So you might want to take a look. And Kate, if you're interested, you should email me and I'm happy to add you to the district. Well, anyone can be on my distribution list. Largely, it's not district driven, but especially Kate, if you'd be interested, I'd love to add you to the list. About 2,000 people in the district get it now.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have you. And hopefully someday we can invite you to our headquarters on Newbury Street and we can be in person, but it's so wonderful that we can all be together tonight and talk about issues in your background. It's really been an awesome night of learning. So I really appreciate it. I want to